My name is Lena Whitford. I'm 34 years old, and at 6:58 on a humid Saturday night, while shrimp boil steam and citronella smoke hung over the rear service patio of a waterfront hotel ballroom, my mother finally said the thing this family had been teaching me to hear for years. Catering carts rattled over the brick. Ice clinked in bus tubs. Somewhere beyond the service doors, a band was easing into the first dance, while my younger brother Ethan and his new wife smiled under chandeliers paid for with promises they had never been the ones forced to keep. I was still wearing the pale blue dress I had changed into after confirming the final vendor packet, checking the balance sheet one last time, and answering a planner text about the storm watch because weddings, unlike families, do not stop needing contracts just because someone says vows near the water. Then Marjorie Whitford pointed me toward a folding chair beside the waitstaff tables, looked at the servers like she was assigning one more task, and said, "You're here to work, not to be seen." She said it in front of two cousins, the banquet captain, a florist's assistant, and Claire's mother, who had spent 6 months believing this wedding was held together by romance and not by my LLC, my wire transfers, and my refusal to let Ethan's irresponsibility cost him the ballroom date. That line should have humiliated me into tears. Instead, it clarified everything. I did not remind my mother who had stepped in when the original deposit failed, who negotiated the payment schedule, who fronted the rescue money, who read every clause, handled every shortfall, and made sure this wedding did not die under late invoices and bad timing. I did not ask whether Ethan even knew whose name sat on the venue contract, the final payment escrow, and the weather rider. I just stood there with steam, smoke, and old resentment in the back of my throat and understood, all at once, that none of this was sudden. Ethan got celebrated. I got deployed. Claire got welcomed. I got used. In this family, I was good enough to save the wedding, just never good enough to sit inside it like I belonged there. So I took the folding chair, stayed exactly long enough to watch my brother thank everyone who made tonight possible without saying my name, and left before cake was served. 2 days later, the planner called in a panic because a storm-related damage claim and 2 unpaid vendor balances had triggered a payout hold, and the venue contract, the escrow release, and the insurance rider were all still in my name. Before I tell you what she said, and why my mother suddenly needed me to be mature, tell me what time it is where you are and where you're watching from. I always want to know how far a story like this travels before it lands on someone who already knows what it feels like to fund the celebration and still get seated with the help. Here's what my mother didn't understand when she pointed me toward the catering tables like I was staff she had already paid for. They thought they were doing what they had always done. Give Ethan the spotlight, let Claire inherit the glow, and trust that I would keep the ugly financial architecture standing because I always had. What they were actually doing was humiliating the one person who knew exactly where the entire wedding was legally fragile. I work in event finance and contract administration, which means I do not hear phrases like family wedding or special day the way other people do. I hear deposit timing, default language, liability allocation, escrow release conditions, weather contingencies, vendor exposure, and the exact point where sentiment starts pretending it can outrun signatures. 6 months earlier, Ethan and my mother had nearly lost the ballroom date altogether. Their original deposit schedule slipped. The venue sent the polite warning first, then the sharper one. The planner tried to keep everybody calm, but calm does not move money. Claire's family was already talking invitations and floral direction, while the date itself was one missed wire away from disappearing. So I stepped in the way I always had, quietly, through my LLC. I fronted the rescue deposit, negotiated a staggered payment structure, and insisted that the final disbursements sit in a controlled escrow arrangement instead of trusting Ethan to catch up after bonuses or my mother to move some things around. I also became the contracting party on the ballroom agreement because the venue had stopped accepting family optimism as security. And when hurricane season forecasts started looking ugly for the coast, I took the weather and cancellation rider under my own authority because somebody had to be a real adult on paper. None of that made me photogenic. Ethan still got to be the golden son in the custom tux, the one relatives toasted for finally growing up. Claire got to be the beautiful bride. My mother got to preen around the room telling people how much she had done to make the wedding happen. I got the vendor term sheets, the emergency calls, the budget compression, the rehearsal week payment reconciliations, and the specific humiliation of being treated like hired help inside an event that would have collapsed without my name and my money. By 8:11 Monday morning, 2 days after the wedding, I was at my kitchen table with cold coffee beside my laptop, pulling the whole chain back up because I already knew Saturday had not ended at insult. It had moved into exposure. Venue contract first. My name still sitting there as the live contracting party. Then the escrow instructions and release conditions. Then the insurance rider documents. Then the wire confirmations, vendor balance sheet, and planner emails from the months my mother now likes to describe as that stressful little period. As if the wedding had not nearly died because Ethan was careless, and she was convinced enthusiasm counted as solvency. After that, I opened her texts, and once I stripped the mother tone off them, they read like a confession. Save your brother's wedding quietly. Do not embarrass him over money. This is what family does. After everything your mother did to make this happen, don't make paperwork into punishment. There it was again. Ethan got celebrated. I got the chain beneath the celebration. At 9:07, the planner, Renee Barlow, called in exactly the tone professionals use when a pleasant event has started turning back into the contract it always was. The venue had reported storm-related exterior damage after the wedding. 2 vendor balances were still showing open. The ballroom's claims coordinator had triggered a payout hold until authority, disbursement, and rider cooperation were confirmed. I asked one question first. Who do they think controls the release? Her pause told me enough before she answered. Your mother was speaking like the family would handle it internally, she said. But the documents still point to you. There it was. What they didn't know was that they had not humiliated a resentful sister. They had humiliated the woman whose name still sat on every part of the chain that mattered. By 9:41, I made the first professional move. I did not call my mother and ask whether she had already promised Ethan and Claire a clean honeymoon start, a fast claim cooperation statement, and vendor payments they had no authority to release. I did not text Ethan and ask whether thanking everyone without naming me had felt worth it. I confirmed with the planner that no disbursement, release, or insurance cooperation statement was authorized without written instruction from me. Then I sent one email to the venue, the claims coordinator, the planner, and counsel, clarifying that no transfer of contract authority, escrow control, or rider administration had been executed, and that any assumption otherwise should be treated as premature. No drama. No family speech. Just the end of assumption. The consequences hit faster than I expected. By late morning, the florist wanted to know when her open balance would clear. By noon, the venue's claims coordinator had asked for confirmation of who was actually authorized to speak for the event file. By 1:18, my mother had called twice and Ethan once, but I let all 3 ring out because the bigger stake had finally surfaced. This was not just about whether my brother and his bride looked embarrassed after the wedding. Their whole married life narrative had already started leaning on money and releases they thought they could still pull through me. Funny how quickly "don't ruin the wedding" turns into "why aren't you answering?" once the celebration ends and the paperwork survives. By 10:42 that morning, the tone had already shifted from family annoyance to professional panic. Not because anyone had suddenly developed a conscience. Not because my mother woke up ashamed that she had seated me beside the catering carts after I was the one who kept the ballroom from disappearing 6 months earlier. Because the wedding had ended, the flowers were already drooping in hotel trash bags, and the paperwork had survived them. I was in my home office reconciling a non-profit gala budget for an actual client, one screen on projected food and beverage variances, one on a vendor aging report, and one on the Whitford wedding file I had no intention of touching emotionally. At 10:47, Ethan called for the first time. I let it ring out. At 10:51, Claire texted, "Renee says there's confusion with the venue, but Mom is handling it." At 10:58, my mother texted, "Don't make this uglier than it needs to be." There it was again. Their unpaid balances, my ugliness. Their claim exposure, my attitude problem. At 11:06, the family thread woke up after 48 hours of wedding photos, honeymoon airport selfies, and Ethan thanking everybody who made the weekend magical, without naming the woman whose LLC had stopped the venue from canceling them. Mom wrote, "Lena, answer your phone." Ethan followed with, "This is just cleanup stuff." Claire added, "We really need maturity right now." Cleanup stuff. Maturity. I almost laughed. As if final payment escrow, claim coordination, and weather rider administration were decorative details instead of the structure that kept their little newlywed mythology from running face first into default language. I let the thread sit and finished the nonprofit variance note because I wanted one more ordinary piece of real work done before I stepped fully into the family emergency they had manufactured. At 11:21, the venue's claims coordinator called, and that was the official trouble at the door. Her name was Paula Jeffries, and she had the exact tone women in hotel risk departments use when they have already heard too many soft family stories and intend to replace all of them with signature lines. "Ms. Whitford," she said, "I need confirmation on 2 points before any disbursement can move. 1. There is exterior weather damage tied to post-event cleanup and access. 2. 2 open vendor balances remain unresolved. Our file shows you as the contracting party and escrow authority. Are we still working through you?" There it was. Not because they missed me, not because they were sorry, because the venue contract still knew my name, and contracts do not get sentimental after cake. I told Paula that no authority transfer had been approved, and that all claim, escrow, and balance questions were to remain in writing. At 11:34, she emailed the summary. Storm-related tenting damage, overtime service adjustment, florist balance, lighting subcontractor balance, hold status active. 4 concrete problems, neatly lined up, all waiting for a woman my family had just tried to seat with the help. By 12:03, Renee called again, this time without the false calm she had used that morning. "Lena, your mother keeps saying the family will handle it, but Paula won't move without written authorization, and the florist is threatening to add late fees by 5, she said. I asked the only question that mattered. Did my mother tell anyone Ethan or Claire could authorize release? Renee paused, and that pause told me enough before she answered. She said you'd calm down and sign once things were less emotional. There it was. The whole family doctrine in one sentence. Public disrespect first, private reliance after. They did not just expect my money. They expected my emotional discipline to function as a built-in waiver. At 12:41, the escrow bank officer entered the story. He called to confirm whether the final disbursement instructions on file were still active, because the venue had flagged a contractual hold, and family members had begun asking whether partial release could happen informally pending claim resolution. Informally. I asked his name, confirmed the account, and said, no informal release, no verbal authorization, no change. Short enough to sting. He thanked me immediately, which is how professionals sound when one adult finally appears in a room full of relatives. At 1:17, Ethan's tone changed from irritated to alarmed. He called twice in 6 minutes, then texted, "The florist says this can affect photos and vendor references." Claire wrote, "Please don't punish us over Mom." My mother followed with, After everything I did to make this happen, you owe your brother one smooth ending. There it was again. Oh, their wedding debt dressed up as maternal sacrifice. Not because they cared what they had done Saturday night, because something had already started falling apart outside the family bubble. The venue had a hold. The bank had a freeze. The vendors had open balances, and every path back to smooth still ran through the daughter they had told to sit with the staff. By 2:06, the thread had turned openly accusatory. Ethan wrote, "You are making our first week of marriage about yourself." Claire added, "Normal people would help first and sort hurt feelings later." That one sat in my chest for a second because it was so cleanly inverted. Their use of me became my vanity. Their dependence became my selfishness. I typed back exactly 4 words. Be mature about contracts. Then I put the phone down and went back to the client report in front of me, because panic has never once improved a legal position. At 2:49, Paula emailed again, copying Renee and the escrow officer, to say the hold would remain until the contracting party confirmed how vendor balances, damage cooperation, and final disbursement were to be handled. By 3 o'clock, the whole thing had changed texture. Not because they had found remorse, not because they missed me, because the same people who thought I would quietly clean up behind their wedding were now discovering that ceremony ends, but paper keeps talking. What would you do when the family that humiliated you in public suddenly needed your signature to keep their marriage from starting inside a claim, a freeze, and a public lie? The next morning, the story changed categories. Up to that point, my mother still thought this was about whether I was being generous enough. Ethan still thought it was about whether I was bitter enough to punish him. And Claire clearly believed the right mix of softness and newlywed innocence could flatten the whole thing into one more family mess I would absorb because I always had. But at 8:12 Wednesday morning, Paula Jeffries sent the venue's formal hold memo. The escrow officer sent the release restriction note, and Renee forwarded the updated vendor balance sheet with my name sitting at the center of the authority chain, like a spotlight nobody in my family had expected to turn on. The wording on those 3 documents made my whole body go cold, in a way the wedding itself had not. The issue was no longer whether my feelings had been hurt on a service patio. It was whether my name was being publicly leveraged inside a contract, an escrow structure, and an insurance rider after my authority had been publicly erased. That was when the story stopped being emotional and became about self-preservation. I called Paula first and asked the one question that mattered. Has anyone represented, directly or indirectly, that I already approved escrow release and that this is just a temporary communication issue? She paused, and in my line of work, silence is often cleaner than speech. Then she said, "Your mother described it as a family matter that would be resolved once you calmed down. Our problem is that the contracting party and the public family narrative do not match." There it was. The Whitford family religion translated into venue language. My work was assumed. My consent was atmospheric. My brother's perfect wedding weekend was apparently more real than the legal chain I had built to keep it from collapsing. I thanked Paula, hung up, and opened a new folder on my desktop labeled exactly what the situation had become. Whitford Wedding / Unauthorized Family Reliance / Full Record. Then I built the file the way I build anything that needs to survive charm, denial, and selective memory. Venue contract first, my LLC fixed in the contracting party line. Then the escrow instructions, each disbursement condition still keyed to my approval path. Then the rain and cancellation rider, where my name sat as the active insured contact because when hurricane forecasts started flexing 6 months earlier, I was the one the broker trusted to read risk without turning it into a family feeling. Then the wire confirmations, then the planner emails, then the vendor balance sheets, then the texts from my mother that had looked sentimental at the time and read indecent once I stripped away the maternal tone. Save your brother's wedding quietly. Don't embarrass him over money. This is what family does. After everything your mother did to make this happen, don't turn paperwork into punishment. Punishment. There it was again. Not gratitude, not trust, not partnership. Image. I thought about being 28 and sending a rescue wire for Ethan's lease break fee, because my mother said one mistake should not ruin a young man's future. I thought about being 31 and negotiating with a florist after a family reunion deposit bounced, while Ethan laughed through toasts, and my mother cried about how hard she worked to hold everyone together. I thought about being 33 and covering a funeral catering balance because it would look awful if the family account fell short in public. Every time I absorbed a crisis, they called me mature. Every time I asked for structure, they called me cold. Saturday night had not invented that hierarchy. It had just finally embarrassed it. At 10:06, the planner sent the official bridge I needed. Renee forwarded the internal event chronology, and right there in the middle was a line noting that Family liaison Marjorie Whitford advised post-event obligations would be handled internally once Lena settled. Once Lena settled. That sentence told the whole story. They had not merely assumed I would help. They had already been telling professionals that my resistance was emotional weather, temporary, feminine, and therefore ignorable. That moved the whole thing out of sibling injury and into misrepresentation. If vendors, the venue, and the insurer were being asked to treat my authority as automatic after my mother publicly reduced me to labor, then this was not just family disrespect. It was an attempted conversion of my restraint into liability. At 10:42, my mother called from the house line, which meant she was done trying to sound hurt and ready to sound managerial. I answered because by then I wanted her plain voice, not her mother voice. "This has gone far enough," she said. No hello, no Lena. "Claire is beside herself. Ethan's first week of marriage is being poisoned, and Paula does not need to hear every private irritation you've ever had with this family." I asked, "Did you tell them I had already agreed?" Silence. Then, "I told them the family had this handled." I wrote that down too, because it was not just dishonest. It was revealing. My mother had never believed my authority was real authority. She believed it was back-end labor with a contract attached, the kind that should dissolve the second the golden sun needed the ending to stay pretty. "No," I told her. "What you want is not peace. It's retroactive permission." She went sharp immediately. "After everything I did to make this happen, you owe your brother a clean start." Oh, there it was again. Debt. The debt I was apparently supposed to keep paying because I knew how to stop their milestones from rotting under unpaid balances and bad timing. "What I owe," I said, "is accuracy to every agreement carrying my name." Then I ended the call and sent one written instruction to Paula, the escrow officer, Renee, and counsel, confirming that no transfer of contract authority, escrow control, or insurance cooperation had been approved, and that any contrary representation should be treated as unauthorized. At 11:19, Ethan texted, Mom says you're doing this because you can't stand not being thanked. I read it once and filed it, because by then I could finally name the relationship accurately enough to stop bleeding inside it. This was not love under pressure, not family at a hard moment, not celebration gone messy. It was extraction dressed up as elegance, not gratitude, debt, not belonging, access. The post-wedding brunch started Sunday at 11 a.m., and I walked into my mother's house at 11:21 because timing matters when people are still relaxed enough inside their own lie to keep performing it. The dining room table was staged like proof of innocence. Wrapped gifts were stacked in neat towers by the bay window. White peonies sat in 2 crystal vases my mother only used when she wanted a room to look expensive enough to forgive her. The air smelled like coffee, cinnamon rolls, sugar glaze, and cut fruit beginning to warm under July light. Claire's relatives stood near the sideboard balancing mimosas. Ethan was in the center of the room in a polo and pressed khakis, smiling like a man who thought marriage had already turned him into the version of himself everyone was supposed to admire. Claire sat on a dining chair near the gifts, opening envelopes and laughing in that bright, newlywed way women laugh when they still believe the administrative part of life belongs to somebody else. My mother moved between guests with a serving tray in her hands, all soft hospitality and moral authority. Good. The room was full. The right witnesses were there. Better still, Renee the planner stood by the kitchen archway with her clipboard tucked against her ribs. The florist had arrived to pick up 2 leftover centerpieces, and the venue's claims coordinator was on speakerphone waiting for the family to settle the last details. They had built me a public room without knowing it. My mother saw me first and crossed the breakfast room fast, smile still attached but thinner now. "Lena," she said under her breath, "don't do this here." There it was again. Their public lie, my ugliness. Their attempted theft of my authority, my timing. "You already did that when you thanked everyone except the person whose name kept the wedding alive," I said. Ethan turned at the sound of my voice and raised his chin just enough for both families to hear him. "Look who finally came to support us," he said. That was my ignition line handed to me for free. Support would have been a strange word to use before you started asking for releases under contracts you do not control, I said. The room did not go silent all at once. It thinned. Claire's mother stopped reaching for a pastry. One of my aunts lowered her glass. Renee stopped pretending to study her clipboard. Good. The room had started listening. I set my folder on the dining room table beside the gift envelopes and opened it without hurry. Venue contract, escrow instructions, insurance rider, wire confirmations, vendor balance sheet. Then I turned the first pages toward Renee and the speakerphone on the counter, instead of toward my family, because professionals are usually the first honest people left in rooms like that. Before anyone here keeps talking about this wedding like it is simply over, I said, the venue contract, the final payment escrow, and the weather-and-cancellation rider are all still in my name, and no transfer of authority has ever been approved. Claire laughed too fast. Oh my God, are you seriously doing this at brunch? You did it first, I said. You just did it with thank you cards and croissants. That line moved through the room because even the relatives who did not understand the contracts understood the shape of the lie. My mother stepped closer and lowered her voice into that sharp whisper she always used when she wanted morality to sound like manners. Be mature. No, I said. Be accurate. Then I lifted the planner's forwarded chronology and read the line out loud. Family liaison Marjorie Whitford advised post-event obligations would be handled internally once Lena settled. I looked at Renee, not my mother. Did I ever tell you I had settled anything? Renee's face changed in the exact way competent women's faces change when they are done protecting someone else's family image. No, she said, quiet but clear. That mattered. I picked up the escrow instruction sheet next. The final disbursement requires my written release, I said. The rider cooperation statement requires my authorization. The venue claim response remains tied to me. None of that changed because Ethan got married. Ethan's face tightened. Claire's father finally stopped smiling. On the speakerphone, Paula Jeffries from the venue cleared her throat and said, flat enough to cut through sugar glaze and linen napkins, "That is correct. Our file has not been reassigned." There it was. Official trouble in the middle of brunch. One of Claire's bridesmaids, who had apparently stayed over from the wedding weekend, actually whispered, "Wait, then who paid for this?" And nobody answered quickly enough, which was answer enough. Ethan recovered first, because men like him always think volume can outrun sequence. "You are humiliating us over paperwork," he snapped. There was the inversion exactly where it always shows up. Venue liability becomes paperwork. Escrow control becomes paperwork. Insurance cooperation becomes paperwork. Women like me are always expected to carry the file quietly until the moment we use it, and then suddenly it is just paperwork. "No," I said. "I'm refusing to let labor be erased into gratitude." That was the needle line, and it landed because even my mother went still for half a second. Then I laid the wire confirmations and vendor balance sheets in a clean row across the table. "Since everyone is here celebrating the beginning," I said, "let's be honest about what actually got you to the aisle." I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I did not perform pain for people who had confused my silence with surrender for years. I just named the chain. Rescue deposit through my LLC, negotiated payment schedule, controlled escrow, open balances still unpaid, claim hold still active. Ethan looked at the papers like people always look at numbers when they have spent too long assuming someone else would absorb them. Claire's mother sat down without meaning to. On speaker, Paula added, "Until the contracting party authorizes next steps, the hold remains in place." The florist, who had been shifting awkwardly by the sideboard, said under her breath, "That's not what we were told." There it was, the lie dying audibly. Not in a scream, in procedure. In the texture change of a room realizing the beautiful story had a back office, and the wrong people had been standing in it all along. My mother went pale, then angry. "After everything I did to make this happen, you would shame your brother like this?" she hissed. I looked at the peonies, the wrapped gifts, the wedding photos propped on the piano, the people she had invited to witness her version of family, and then back at her. "You used my silence as part of the decor," I said. "I'm just the first person in the room willing to remove it." That was the end of the performance, even if no one cried yet, because the room had already turned procedural. Renee stepped away from the island and closer to the folder. Claire's aunt started whispering to her husband. Ethan stopped looking like a groom and started looking like a man inside a claim. I closed the file, picked it up, and stepped back before the moment could cheapen itself into sobbing and amateur forgiveness. At the front hall, Ethan called after me, voice strained now. "So what? This is revenge?" I turned once. "No," I said. This is what happens when the person you use learns where the release forms are. Then I walked out into the Charleston heat while the brunch kept trying to breathe behind me without clean escrow, without easy blame, and without the sister they had always counted on to make the ugly part disappear. When a family uses your labor as invisible infrastructure for their milestones, is telling the truth revenge? Or just self-defense after too many celebrations built on your silence? Public exposure did not fix me. It did not send me home glowing with justice or walking barefoot through my apartment feeling clean, brave, and finally understood. It made me feel wired, ashamed, and so awake at 2:11 a.m. that I was sitting on the floor beside my bed with one lamp on, my heels still under the chair, and a yellow legal pad in my lap, because some old part of my body still believed stopping the family machine was more dangerous than being fed into it. That is the part people lie about when they tell stories like this badly. They pretend truth feels like relief the second it is spoken. It doesn't. Not when you were trained for years to believe your value lived in how quietly you could absorb the cost before anyone else had to feel it. By Monday morning, the tactic shift had already started. My mother texted first, saying Claire had cried all night, Ethan was furious, and both families were deeply unsettled by my behavior at brunch. Derek followed with the practical version, saying the florist was agitated, the venue claims coordinator was now making things sound legal, and I had turned what should have been a soft first week of marriage into a crisis. Ethan's messages were uglier because he finally stopped pretending gratitude had ever been on the table. The first said I had always needed control. The second said I could never let anyone else have a moment. The third said I was punishing him for being loved differently. The fourth was the truest without meaning to be. You could have let us start clean. There it was again. The whole Whitford theology in one sentence. Let the golden child have the beginning. Let the useful daughter have the burden. Let me carry the contract, the escrow, the rider, the rescue deposit, the balances, the ugly back end, and then call me cruel the second I refuse to disappear behind it. What unsettled me most was not what they said. It was the old, conditioned part of me that still wanted permission. Permission to stop rescuing. Permission to stop cushioning. Permission to stop translating my mother's panic into process just because I knew how. So instead of answering them, I did what my family has always hated most. I took the pattern somewhere honest. My therapist, Joanna Price, has an office above a tax practice on Broad Street that smells faintly like cedar and copier heat. And by Monday afternoon, I was sitting across from her with my blazer still on, because I knew if I got comfortable first, I would start minimizing. I gave her the facts and order because order is the only form my mind trusts when family starts lying. The rehearsal dinner, the folding chair by the service tables, my mother's line, the unpaid balances, the hold, the brunch, the contract, the escrow, the venue coordinator on speaker. My brother asking whether self-defense was revenge because the paperwork had finally learned his name. Joanna let me finish, then asked the one question that changed the category of the story. When did your family first teach you that usefulness was the price of belonging? I looked at the seam in the rug for a long time, because I already knew the answer, and because saying it aloud would make it harder to romanticize later. I was 15 when I paid the first household shortfall my mother called a temporary shuffle, and got praised for being mature instead of asked whether I was okay. I was 24 when Ethan missed rent, and I wired the rescue money because he had his whole future ahead of him. I was 32 when I salvaged a charity gala my mother had bungled and listened to her thank everyone except the woman who kept the ballroom from suing. Joanna did not tell me to forgive them. She asked the better question. How long have you been calling extraction family? That one stayed in my ribs. I went home and wrote the pattern down the way I write every chronology that needs to survive scrutiny. Ethan creates crisis. Mom turns it into moral duty. Derek calls structure unkind. I pay. I smooth. I disappear. Once it was on paper, the guilt lost some of its holiness. It started looking less like conscience and more like training. Then came the meeting. My mother texted Tuesday morning asking for one last adult conversation before this gets beyond repair, which in my family has always meant, let us rename the damage before the documents do it for us. I agreed only because I wanted the truth said in a room where nobody could hide behind wedding photos, sugar glaze, or the word family. We met that afternoon in my mother's dining room, the same room where she had hosted Claire's relatives 24 hours earlier, with half the unopened gifts still stacked against the wall, like evidence nobody had bothered to remove. My mother started with revision. She said the seating arrangement at the wedding had been unfortunate, not cruel. Ethan said the brunch had only been meant to keep things positive. Claire, for once, said almost nothing, which was the most honest thing anyone in that house had offered. Derek said no one expected me to make a public issue out of what should have stayed inside the family. Then I laid the papers down one by one. Venue contract, escrow instructions, insurance rider, wire confirmations, vendor balances, planner emails. My mother's texts telling me to save the wedding quietly. The room changed the way rooms always change when paper finally outruns tone. My mother snapped first. You always need documents to make yourself look righteous. No, I said. I need documents when people around me keep trying to use my restraint as authorization. Derek called me rigid. Ethan called me vindictive. Then he said the truest thing in the room by accident. You could have just released the money and let us deal with the rest later. There it was. Not love, not trust. Access. Clean enough to stop pretending. Something inside me went still then. Not dramatic, not wounded, just finished. I am not releasing escrow to protect a lie, I said. I am not signing a clean cooperation statement so you can start married life without the embarrassment you earned. I am not financing, guaranteeing, or administrating one more Whitford celebration that treats me like hired help and expects me to call it family. And I am done. My mother called that cruel. Derek said I was making everything final over paperwork. Ethan started raising his voice in that ragged, offended way men do when the woman who always cleaned up finally stops. I stood up anyway. No, I said. I'm just done being your back office. Then I took my file and left them in that dining room while they were still trying to turn consequences back into disrespect. The fallout took 5 weeks, and the reason it landed so hard was that it moved through the boring places first. Not through dramatic apologies, not through some big family collapse where everyone suddenly said the quiet part out loud. Through vendor aging, claim review, escrow restriction, and the kind of written clarification that makes charm sound childish. Paula kept the venue hold active until the damage issue, the overtime exposure, and the open balances were resolved under the actual contracting authority. The florist stopped pretending patience was part of her artistry and sent a revised invoice with late fee language attached. The lighting subcontractor refused to close the file without written assurance on payment path. The escrow officer would not release the final disbursement without my signature, and for the first time in Ethan's life, a celebration he thought he had already survived kept sending him back into rooms where someone had to talk about money plainly. That was the first chain reaction. Their wedding story did not collapse because I yelled. It collapsed because official people started asking official questions in writing, and once that happens, sentiment has nowhere to hide. Claire's side of the family noticed before mine admitted anything. Her mother stopped posting honeymoon captions and started asking when the florist situation would be cleaned up. One of the bridesmaids who worked in luxury events texted me privately to ask whether the venue claim had really been filed under my authority because that explains a lot. The planner, who had been trying for months to hold the weekend together with good posture and vendor diplomacy, got quieter in that very professional way people do when they realize the family at the center of an event has been lying about who actually kept it alive. Even Ethan's thank you language changed. No more broad little lines about everybody who made the day magical. Suddenly it was vague posts about unexpected post-event complexities, which is social media language for, we thought the pretty part would outlast the paperwork. My mother hated that most. Not the hold, not the invoices, that strangers had started asking the exact questions I had been answering alone for 6 months. She tried every version of her old script. First, she called me bitter, then punitive. Then she moved into the softer, meaner register she always used when she wanted rescue to sound righteous. "You are punishing a marriage now," she said in one voicemail. "You are punishing your brother's future," she said in another. What she never said was the truth. She had tried to build Ethan's beginning on my contract, my escrow control, my rider, my money, and my willingness to stay invisible. The second invisibility ended, so did the fantasy that Ethan's gratitude-free wedding weekend counted as a completed story. I did not rescue the whole thing, but I did one narrow ethical thing because boundaries are not the same as collateral cruelty. Through counsel, I authorized payment release only for the 2 vendors whose balances were fully documented, undisputed, and already earned under the original schedule, with every instruction routed through the escrow file and copied to the venue. Nothing broader. No blanket release. No clean insurance cooperation statement written to protect my mother's reputation. No quiet smoothing so Ethan and Claire could go back to telling themselves everybody had overreacted. Just one controlled act separating actual obligations from family mythology. After that, I became unavailable in the only way that matters. Written only. Every venue question through counsel. Every vendor question through counsel. Every, "Can we please talk like family?" ignored unless it came attached to an actual document and an actual issue. About a month after the brunch, Paula requested a formal declaration confirming that no transfer of contract authority, escrow control, or rider administration had ever been approved, and that any contrary representation had been made without my consent. The escrow officer wanted matching written confirmation for the bank file. I reviewed both, corrected one date on the overtime notation, tightened one sentence about authority, and signed them that same afternoon. No embellishment, no revenge monologue, no daughterly sadness hidden inside legal language. Just a clean record. That was more devastating than any scream I could have made at the wedding, because once the facts were fixed in the venue file, the escrow chain, and the insurance record, my mother could no longer keep narrating me into the role of bitter sister instead of the woman who had quietly kept the whole event from imploding months before vows were ever exchanged. Facts do not care who looked beautiful in candlelight. They only care who signed, who paid, and who lied. A month later, my mother asked to meet, and I almost said no because by then I understood something I had spent most of my adult life trying not to understand. Closure is not the same thing as restored access, and access is not the same thing as love. Still, I agreed to one final meeting because I wanted the truth said in a room where nobody could soften it back into wedding weather. We met at 4:34 on a Thursday in my attorney's conference room, late afternoon light flattening against the blinds, stale coffee cooling untouched near the side credenza, and the kind of dry office air that makes every sentence sound more official than the speaker intended. Marjorie arrived first in one of her soft cream wraps, the kind she always wore when she wanted to look maternal, burdened, and morally blameless all at once. Derek came in next with the posture of a man who had spent years standing beside the wrong decisions, and still hoped that counted as calm. Ethan came last, no tuxedo now, no wedding glow, just a man who had finally learned that gratitude is not retroactive, and marriage does not erase a paper trail. Claire sat beside him and said almost nothing, which was the most honest contribution anyone from that side had made in weeks. My mother opened exactly the way I knew she would. Not with apology, with hardship. "This has been devastating for the family," she said. There it was, the old rearrangement. Blur the damage, make it communal, make it sound like weather so nobody has to name where it began. I let the silence sit there long enough to become useful. Then I gave her the cleanest sentence I had. "You built Ethan's wedding ending on my contract, my escrow control, my insurance authority, and my money, then told me I was there to work and not to be seen." My mother cried after that, and maybe the tears were real. They usually are by the time consequence finally reaches people who thought sentiment counted as structure. But tears are weather, not proof, and I had finally learned not to confuse visible pain with accountability. Derek tried next because men like him always step in after the first softness fails. "We were trying to give Ethan and Claire a clean start," he said. "That's all this ever was." I looked at him and felt nothing but accuracy. "No," I said. "That's what you told yourselves. What it actually was another celebration built on the assumption that I would absorb the risk and disappear behind it." Ethan spoke then, and the saddest part was that he still sounded more embarrassed than ashamed. "Mom said you'd calm down once the weekend was over," he said. "I thought the back-end stuff would get handled." There it was, the whole family structure in one sentence. He got the vows. I got the liabilities. He got the toasts. I got the contract chain, the rescue deposit, the unpaid balances, and the part nobody wanted to look at while it was saving them. "That was always the luxury you were given," I told him. "Other people were assigned the seriousness for you." My mother asked the fantasy question after that, the one families like mine always ask once the useful daughter is still physically in the room, but no longer psychologically available on command. "Is there any way to fix this?" she said. That line might once have worked on me because I used to hear vague pain and immediately start converting it into labor. A release, a statement, a softened consequence, a way to keep everyone from having to feel the full shape of what they did. But by then I knew the difference between being needed and being loved, and they are not interchangeable no matter how many mothers cry when the file stops protecting them. "You can't fix this with emotion," I said. "You can only deal with it through sequence." Then I told them what accountability actually meant. Not tears in a conference room after the public story had already failed. Not calling me family now that the venue, the vendors, and the escrow officer had all stopped cooperating. Accountability is changed behavior that costs you something. Accountability is telling the truth before the contract forces it. Accountability is admitting out loud that you used one daughter as infrastructure while celebrating the son standing on it. My mother flinched at that because it was the first sentence in the room she could not decorate. Derek asked if everything now had to go through attorneys. "Anything involving money, contracts, family events, guarantees, insurance, or emergency rescue does," I said. "For anything else, maybe one day, if behavior changes before language does." That was the real answer. Not reconciliation, not permanent exile. Structure, distance, terms. 6 weeks later, I used the recovered escrow funds and what remained after the documented releases to close on a historic downtown condo in my own name. Brick walls, tall windows, clean title, and not one family expectation hidden in the wiring. I signed alone, and the quiet afterward felt better than any apology they might have tried to improvise. No floral centerpiece, no champagne toast. No mother retelling the story until she looked generous inside it. Just a closing packet, a set of keys, and the first space I had ever entered that did not already expect something from me. Then my attorney sent the final notice. Clean, narrow, non-negotiable. I would never again finance, guarantee, insure, administer, or quietly salvage any Whitford family celebration that treated me like labor while asking me to call it love. No more off-record rescue, no more just this once. No more family emergencies dressed up as moral duty. I approved the letter without changing a word. That was the deeper revenge. Not that Ethan's clean beginning had to survive its own paperwork. Not that my mother had to watch the wedding story shrink under holds, balances, and formal corrections. Not even that Derek finally had to learn the difference between gratitude and access. The deeper revenge was this. I was no longer available for the role they had written for me. I was not the back office, not the rescue wire, not the daughter who made the celebration real while someone else got photographed inside it. They did not miss me as blood. They missed the function. Too many families call that love because admitting the difference would force them to look at what they built. So tell me honestly, if your family only remembered your value when the contract, the escrow, or the insurance were at risk, would you ever let them back in once you finally put your own name on the door? And what would have been your breaking point? The chair by the catering carts? The payout hold? The fake brunch? Or the moment you realized they never really meant family in a way that included your dignity?